My wife regrets listening to advice to improve our marriage. I'm here to ask advice on how to save my marriage. Let me start by saying I've been married to my husband for 5 years. We've been together for 7 years. For confidentiality, I'm going to refer to us as James and Skylar. We met in our second year of community college. I got a 2-year degree in office management. James went on to obtain a 4-year degree, and I got a degree in business administration from a university that offers remote classes at the community college. Fast forward to today. I'm 26, James is 27, and we were planning on starting a family later this year. We wanted to have 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. We had a very happy marriage, and our 2 families loved both of us. Here's where I messed up. Roy and I started seeing each other while I was still married. Some people might call it having a work husband, but in my case, it was with a delivery driver for one of the big companies. There are 3 delivery organizations that make deliveries to our office. For confidentiality purposes, let's refer to one of them as Jaden. Jaden is 25 and single. He's been making deliveries to my office for nearly 2 years. From the moment we met, there was a certain chemistry. It wasn't necessarily romantic, but there was an undeniable spark. I was drawn to him, and we'd spend at least 10 minutes talking every time he made a delivery. I always looked forward to seeing him and made sure I was upfront when it was time. One day, our conversation went further than normal. Jaden said he had a personal question to ask me. He said it was very personal and didn't want me to be offended or to jeopardize our working relationship. I told him, "Of course not. You can ask me anything." Then, Jaden told me he felt a very strong attraction to me and wondered if I felt it too. I found his boldness surprising and somewhat embarrassing. After taking a moment to gather my thoughts, I told him the truth. I told him I felt it too. Jaden said he would have asked me out if I weren't married. I thanked him for the compliment, and that was the end of our conversation. He left, and that was that for the next week. We just made brief, awkward small talk when he came in to deliver packages. I was worried and felt guilty that I may have crossed a line with him. I just couldn't shake this feeling at home. James and I were enjoying married life. Let me be clear. I've always been happy with James as a lover, friend, and husband. I think he felt the same way about me. He was perfect for me. That being said, I started to think about how I could have both my loving husband and a relationship with Jaden. I later learned that this is sometimes called being a cake eater. I started to look into it and found some articles about polyamory and open marriages. I thought these ideas I thought it was silly and gross, so I didn't think about it much at the time. I also knew that my husband wouldn't agree to such a thing. Even if he did, it could hurt our marriage and both our families might stop talking to us. That's something I didn't want to happen. Weeks went by, and my married life was going great as always. But I kept thinking about making a connection with Jaden. I started researching the subject again and came across a post online titled, "It Doesn't." It was a blog post by a woman who said she had a successful open marriage. She wrote about how much she loved her husband, but also wanted to be in a relationship with a man she met while doing volunteer work. The blogger said she just didn't know how to approach the subject with her husband without destroying their marriage. She kept these feelings bottled up for over 2 years, and then one day when they were on a long drive, she just decided to ask him. To her surprise, he said yes. He was really interested. Long story short, they opened their marriage, and now they both have partners outside the marriage that they see 3 to 4 times per month. The blogger said they've been doing this for 4 years now, and their marriage is stronger than ever, and they are both happier than ever. Her story caught my attention because it was exactly what I wanted, but I was too scared to ask my husband about it. Then one Sunday morning, as we were lounging around the house, surfing the web on our phones, I decided to bring up the subject. I brought up the subject while chatting casually and asked him directly, "I just read this online post about open marriages. What's your opinion on them?" He then asked me if I was talking about couples sleeping with other people. I confirmed and asked him again what he thought about it. He said he thought it was disgusting and that people should just get divorced if they want to sleep around. I told him it's really becoming popular here in the US and in many Western countries. James's facial expression indicated that I was just put off by the topic, so I quickly changed the subject based on his reaction. "I don't intend to bring it up again. as I'm not interested in jeopardizing our marriage. A few weeks later, James and I are cuddling in bed, high on love after a fantastic, sexy time. I'm lying on his chest and can't see his face when he asks, out of the blue, who I had in mind when I brought up open relationships. Last week, I was taken aback and felt a pit in my stomach. I slowly raised my head and turned to look at him. "What are you talking about?" I asked. James then shared that he had read some research suggesting that if a woman mentions an open relationship to her partner, she has either already cheated or she has someone else lined up. His revelation startled me. It actually shook me to my core. James could see the effect his words had on me. He said, "I know you too well. I could tell you were holding something back, so I asked you to be honest." I fell silent, looked away, and then told you that I had never cheated on you and would never do so. I could have left it at that, but I didn't. I then admitted that if we ever considered an open marriage, there was a friend at work who I might consider. James asked if I could tell him about this work friend. So I began to explain about Jaden and our interactions up until then, including what Jaden had told me about his feelings. But I didn't tell him I'd felt the same way. James's next words shocked me. He said, "Technically, you've already cheated on me." I got annoyed and said I hadn't, but he said I had. He explained that what I had with Jaden was called an emotional affair. I'd never heard of it, so James explained it to me. I got more and more frustrated, and James suggested we decided to table the discussion for now because James needed to get some sleep, given that he had to be up early the next day. He fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my phone and started looking into emotional affairs. I read lots of articles and posts about them. James was right. What I had with Jaden was dangerously close to being an emotional affair. In fact, it was a full-blown emotional affair. I felt terrible, like I'd betrayed my husband. I couldn't sleep, so I got up. I went downstairs and made myself some tea. I eventually fell asleep on the couch around 4 a.m. I woke up at about 6:45 a.m. James woke me with a kiss, saying he was leaving for work and I needed to start my day as it was almost 7 a.m. As usual, I returned his kiss and told him I loved him, but this time I put even more emphasis on the sentiment. My mind was clouded with guilt over my feelings. After a few days, we were lying in bed after making love again when James said he'd be willing to try an open marriage if I really wanted to. I was taken aback, so I asked why he was bringing this up now. He explained that he'd been thinking about our discussions and figured we should try it while we were young. I expressed interest but vowed never to jeopardize our marriage or love, as he was the most important person. James said that if our bond of love is strong, it will withstand infidelity. I said that a mutual open relationship wouldn't be considered infidelity because we would both be agreeing to it instead of commenting on that. He said, "Consider our marriage open starting right now." I was taken aback once more and urged him to slow down, saying we needed to establish ground rules. He said the only ground rules he wanted were the ones we needed to announce who we planned to sleep with. We agreed to the following. We would disclose the encounter to each other afterwards, without going into graphic detail. We would use protection for all forms of sexy time, no exceptions. I added a couple more points. We would keep our open marriage confidential. We would promise each other that these extramarital relationships wouldn't destroy our marriage and we would remain together. James stated that he could not agree to either of these conditions. When I asked why, he simply said James didn't agree to these terms and didn't want to discuss it further. I felt uneasy about this because it was out of character for James, but I cuddled up to him and we fell asleep. My discussions with James left me uneasy about the open relationship. I felt like he had ulterior motives. For the next month, I didn't pursue the open relationship and we lived our lives normally. During this time, I stayed distant from Jaden at work. We had a few quick chats about the weather and how busy we were, and other superficial things. Then one day Jaden told me he really missed our conversations and asked me what was wrong. I told him I was busy at the office and at home and just didn't have time to talk. I was thinking about whether I should tell him about my open marriage. In the end, I decided I would. I wish I could turn back time. I wish I could undo this decision. It didn't seem appropriate to have such a discussion at the office, so instead I invited him to meet for a drink after work that day, and he agreed. We met at a local bar that had an outdoor patio, perfect for the warm early spring weather. I told him about my recently open marriage and came right out and asked him if he'd be interested in a relationship with me. He didn't hesitate and said yes. He said he's been waiting for me. He said he'd been having dreams about me for months. Most of our conversation during that meeting was flirtatious. It was a Tuesday, and we agreed to meet the following day for our first romantic encounter at his apartment right after work. However, I emphasized that I'd need to leave by 6:30 p.m. to return home to my husband, who remained my utmost priority that night. I returned home. After dinner, I told James about my meeting with Jayton earlier that day and that we had a date set up for the next day after work at Jayton's place. I asked James if he was still okay with our open marriage, and he seemed surprised. I confirmed that we were still on for tomorrow, but I told him we could still call it off if he wanted. My main priority was making sure he was happy. James insisted I didn't need to do this, and we hugged, but I could tell he was feeling a bit stiff and distant in the embrace, unlike our usual ones. I figured nerves were probably the reason. We didn't talk much that evening, as he was busy at work and I had my own tasks to complete. When we went to bed, I spooned with him and tried to initiate intimacy, but he mentioned he was too tired and needed to rest the next morning. When I woke up, James had already left, leaving a text explaining he had an early meeting that he forgot to tell me about. He also said that he'd see me that night. This was unlike him, but I brushed it off and kept on with my usual routine of getting dressed and heading to work. I picked an especially cute outfit that day. I knew that Jaden and I were going to meet right after work. Throughout the day, I texted James, but he didn't reply. I was once again thinking about canceling the date with Jaden. I really wish I had told you my story then. At 4:17 p.m., I got a text from James. He said he loved me and would see me that night. I felt a bit relieved, so I took it as a green signal from him to go ahead. I'll get to the point. Jaden and I met up, and it was great. It wasn't quite as satisfying as my time with James, and I didn't feel any love, but it was very fulfilling, mostly because of the lust and the forbidden aspect of what we were doing. I left his place after about an hour and a half and got home just after 6:40 p.m. I was surprised to find that James wasn't home yet. I was okay with this because it gave me time to shower and put my clothes in the washing machine to remove Jaden's cologne smell. I didn't want James to be exposed to this, though. I felt fulfilled physically, but I had a deep feeling of guilt, shame, and remorse. I just felt dirty. I was really torn in my mind and feeling nervous. I decided to make James a quick but great dinner and light some candles to create a romantic mood. I wanted to show him how much I loved him and that the physical affair with Jaden didn't matter to me. It was just physical and nothing like the love and physical fulfillment I have with him. I was hoping we would end our night making love. I know some of you might think this is selfish and gross, but remember I used protection with Jaden, and nobody said anything at 7:30 p.m. James still wasn't home, and I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted him to say I was home and waiting for dinner. I didn't hear anything from him. It was now 8:50 p.m. and I was getting worried. I called him and left messages and sent texts at around 9:30 p.m. I got a text from him saying, "Don't wait up. I'll be home late." I texted back asking where he was and who he was with, but he didn't text back. I was exhausted and fell asleep sometime after midnight. I was awoken by the sound of the shower in the spare bathroom running, so I got up to investigate. The door was locked, which was totally uncharacteristic for James. I knocked on the door, but he didn't answer. About 10 minutes later, James came out wrapped in a towel and asked how my night was. I told him it was fine, but then he asked directly if I'd had sex. I told him not to use that term, but he admitted that he and I had been together. I asked where he'd been, and he said he'd spent the night at several bars and been out dancing. I asked who he was. I could smell perfume on his discarded clothes, so I asked who she was. He said that since they didn't sleep together, he didn't need to tell me who she was. I won't say the explicit words here, but I can add that he never used the F word to me. So, his way of talking to me and using that word made me very worried. I then asked him why he used the guest bathroom to shower. He told me he would be using he said he'd use the guest bedroom and bathroom until I took 2 STD tests. I was really upset and said that wasn't part of our rules. Jaden said he'd use protection for everything we did. He said, "Have you never heard of oral HPV or oral herpes? I'm not getting within 6 feet of you until you're cleared. You can consider this my version of social distancing." I was really upset and cried. I told James the first one. He said he wanted to close our marriage because of this. The last thing I wanted to hear was what James had to say. He said that I had my turn and now it was his turn. I was upset, so I kept crying. He said he was going to bed because he had an early meeting and needed rest. I spent most of the night crying. I eventually fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, James had already left. He had sent me a text saying, "Don't wait up for me." I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. I left him a few messages, but he didn't respond. I was really upset and felt like I'd ruined my marriage. We didn't have any deliveries that day, so I didn't see Jaden, but I called him at 4:30 p.m. and asked if we could meet tonight. He agreed and said I sounded upset. I told him I was, but said we'd talk about it when I got to his place. I told him I wanted to end our relationship and that I loved my husband and only wanted him. I explained the situation and he understood. He asked for one more hookup, after which he'd never interact with me again other than for work purposes. I agreed, and we had a very short hookup in which we only had sex in the missionary position. Afterwards, he told me that was terrible and that I just laid there like I apologized, saying that this whole thing was a big mistake and that it wasn't his fault. I got dressed, gave him a final hug, and left. Before I left, Jaden said, "I'll never understand women like you." I asked what he meant by the comment and he simply said, "Nothing. No comment." He looked disgusted. I quickly left, crying on the entire drive home. How could I have been so stupid? I destroyed my marriage for nothing at all. I thought I felt like the stupidest person in the world. I just felt dirty. James didn't come home until 1 a.m. that night. I was sick knowing that I had single-handedly ruined my life on Friday. James did the same thing and left before I got up. He sent me a text stating, "Don't wait up for me." The distance and coldness were crushing to my soul. I love spending time with my husband in the mornings, evenings, and weekends. His meals, cuddling, taking walks after dinner, and just talking about random stuff. That was all gone, and I missed it so much. I texted James and said I wanted to talk with him tomorrow morning. He texted back and said okay as long as it was first thing, as he was leaving for the day. I responded back asking where he was going, but he didn't reply. He didn't get home until 1:30 a.m. I didn't say anything. He just laid in bed crying. He took another shower and went straight to bed. I woke up early to wait for James to get up. He came into the kitchen at 7 a.m. and poured some orange juice. The vibe was cold and emotionless. He made no eye contact and just sat down at the table with me and started looking at his phone. I got up and went over and plopped down on his lap and said, "Look at me." He looked. I said, "Look at me," and gently grabbed his face, looking into his brown eyes. I told him that I loved him with all my heart and that I made a bad decision. Not a bad mistake, a bad decision. I told him I was sorry and would do anything to regain his trust and love. He didn't say anything and just looked at me like I was insane. I asked him if he loved me, and he said nothing. I said, "James, please answer me." He said he didn't. I started crying and said I could make this right. He told me he didn't think I could. I called him a bastard and said he'd set me up to divorce me. He said he didn't, but he did admit that he knew our marriage was likely over based on what he'd read. I asked him why he didn't just shut me down and demand that I end it. He said, "You can't force someone to be faithful. You either are or you're not. You obviously are not a monogamous person." I just cried and told him I was and that he shouldn't throw us away. He didn't say anything. He just got up and said he was leaving. I asked where he was going. He said he'd be back after midnight. I then reminded him that tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and we were scheduled to leave at 7 a.m. to drive to my parents' house. My family loves my husband and we spend nearly every holiday with him, as his parents now live in Florida. He told me that he wasn't going. I was shocked and upset and asked him to please come with me. He just said no. I asked him what I was going to tell my parents. He said he didn't care. Then he said, "Just tell them the truth." I begged and pleaded with him to stay home with me, but he just got dressed, took a gym bag of clothes and left the house. I'm devastated and feel totally deflated. I'd like to ask you all here for any suggestions and steps I can take to save my marriage. I'd really like to hear from people who have done something similar with open marriages and whether a couple can recover from such a betrayal. I'd also like to hear from people who have successfully reconciled after an open relationship. Thank you for being here and listening. I'm going back to bed now to have a good cry for the rest of the day. I wanted to give everyone an update first. I want to thank those of you who responded with feedback and support. It really helped me get through the last couple of days. There were a lot of people who gave me constructive criticism and called me out on my actions, and I appreciate it. Easter Sunday and today have been very difficult days for me. 2 of the worst days of my life. I drove to my parents' house, and when I arrived, the first thing they asked was where James was. I told them he had an emergency at work and wouldn't be able to make it. I told them this because I didn't want to upset our family gathering. My family bought my story but grew suspicious as the day went on. I wasn't texting or calling my husband like I normally do to deflect suspicion, so I sent several fake texts to throw them off and acted like I received texts back from him. I got texts from him saying he was busy at work and would call tomorrow. In fact, he never called or texted, not even to check in. I was really upset. I planned to stay over at my parents' house and tell them about our problems on Monday. I was dreading it because I knew they would be angry. Well, I told them this morning, and it went just as I thought it would. They yelled and called me terrible names. They didn't raise me like this, and they called my sister to join us. She proceeded to give me a piece of her mind, too. I cried and told them I was sorry. I told them I know what I've done is terrible and that I have learned from this and will never make the same mistake again in the future. I told them my sole focus for the foreseeable future is to win back the love and trust of James. At the end of it all, though, they were very upset with me. They told me they loved me and would pray that our marriage could be salvaged. I drove home Monday evening during the day. I called and texted James, but he didn't reply when I arrived home. I found a note on the counter stating he had gone to Florida to visit his parents and would return on Sunday. I felt so bad because we planned on going to visit them sometime in early May, and now that's not going to happen because of me. I hate myself. I'm really feeling down and sad at the moment. What's worrying me is that I'm no longer crying over the hurt and remorse I feel. It's as if they're worthless. It's been almost a year since I last posted, but there was such an outpouring of interest from the community that I decided to share some news. The bad news is that I'm divorced. It was finalized back in December. I have some news to share. James and I have separated. He said he couldn't trust me again and was embarrassed to be seen in public with me. He felt divorce was the best option for him. I disagree. I don't think he ever lost his masculinity. Only our families know about my brief connection with Jaden. But that's in the past. On a more positive note, James and I started dating again last month. We got back together on Valentine's Day. It's been great since Valentine's Day. We only see each other whenever he wants, which has been about once a week. Our passion level is much higher than when we first got together 7 years ago. He's made it clear to me that this is only physical and that we'll never be married, live together, or be a couple again. I'm okay with this, but I'll take what I can get. My goal is to win him back. I'd like to win James back, but if that doesn't work out, I'd like to have his babies. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to baby trap him. I just want to have children with this man. I've thought about how we could share custody and make this work without being married. I know it sounds crazy, but I love him and don't want children with anyone else. I know that doing so would likely jeopardize any potential relationship I might have with another man, but I'm not looking for anyone else. James is all I have to share now, and I probably won't post again unless something major happens. I'd love to get your feedback on my situation. Do you think I'm crazy for dating James? Should I just try to move on and find another love and start a family with that person instead? Jaden is not an option and never was. He was just a bad decision I made and will never make again. Thanks.